The young and the restless spoilers' shock. No one in Nice could have imagined the storm that was silently brewing beneath their very feet. While the city mourned the death of Damian, a man many believed had been tragically stabbed in a drunken altercation and laid to rest after a somber ceremony, an unspeakable secret was festering in the shadows. Damian, in truth, had never died. He was very much alive, though barely clinging to life, held captive in a hidden chamber far from the reach of daylight or compassion. The architect of this deception was none other than Cain, whose obsession with Lily had spiraled into a sickening game of psychological warfare and physical cruelty. At the center of it was a man bleeding from a wound that had never healed, shackled in chains of both metal and fear, praying not for his own salvation but for Lily to make a choice she never knew held a life in the balance. The world above moved on, oblivious. The funeral had come and gone. Tears were shed, tributes made, and the city of Nice embraced the closure that came with Damian's supposed death. His absence was mourned, his memory etched into the hearts of those who loved him. But none of them knew that every flower laid upon his empty grave was a silent mockery, that every moment of grief was a response to a performance so elaborate, so methodically constructed, it blurred the line between madness and genius. Cain had engineered a perfect illusion, the blood trail, the shattered glass, the corpse that no one questioned too closely, the cremation that followed in haste, all part of a calculated scheme to convince the world that Damian was gone forever. But beneath that illusion lay the bitter truth. In a locked, soundproof basement beneath a remote estate just outside the city limits, Damian lay in agony. The wound in his abdomen, inflicted during a confrontation he never saw coming, had become infected. The pain was constant, searing, and unrelenting. He had been treated just enough to keep him alive, to keep him conscious, to ensure he remained aware of the torment being inflicted upon him. Every day, Cain visited him, not with sympathy or guilt, but with threats, demands, and twisted hope. He would crouch beside Damian's cot, his voice cold, his words calculated like a man making deals with death. "If Lily agrees to love me," Cain whispered each time, "then I'll let you live. I'll set you free. But if she rejects me, you'll die, and it will be on her conscience." This was not a game of vengeance, it was something far darker. Cain's obsession with Lily had evolved into delusion. He no longer believed he could win her heart through affection or redemption. Instead, he would hold her future hostage, coerce her with guilt, and manipulate her emotions until she saw no other path but surrender. The irony was chilling. Lily, a woman of fierce independence and moral clarity, was unknowingly being positioned as the executioner in a crime she had no idea was even unfolding. Every hesitation, every refusal, every expression of distrust toward Cain was not just a statement of emotion but a strike against Damian's chance at survival. And she had no idea. Damian, though battered and broken, refused to give Cain the satisfaction of watching him fall apart. He fought the pain, clenched his teeth through the spasms that shook his body, and held on to the fading belief that the truth would eventually emerge. He had no way to tell time in the darkness, no concept of how long he'd been imprisoned. Days blurred into nights, and the silence between Cain's visits became a torment of its own. His mind wandered in delirium, haunted by memories of Lily's touch, her laugh, her promises of a future they would build together. But now, those hopes were weaponized. Every moment of that imagined future had become a bargaining chip in Cain's cruel equation. If she loves me, you live. If she refuses, you die. Back in Genoa City, Lily was drowning in confusion and grief. Cain had been by her side more often lately, offering comfort, support, even rekindling old memories of their past. But something about him felt wrong, too polished, too patient, too rehearsed. She couldn't shake the feeling that his presence in her life again was more than coincidence. Still grieving Damian's death, she struggled to reconcile the possibility that Cain's return was not born of compassion, but of strategy. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that she held Damian's fate in her hands. Her rejection of Cain, which had been firm and consistent, was slowly becoming a death sentence. Meanwhile, the cracks in Cain's perfect facade were beginning to show. He had taken every precaution, deleted every trace, and erased every thread of evidence linking him to Damian's disappearance. But secrets that grotesque have a way of clawing toward the surface. The caretaker of the estate where Damian was kept had started asking questions. Why did Cain need the basement reinforced? Why did he bring medical supplies and demand privacy for days on end? And why, despite all the supposed closure, did he flinch whenever someone mentioned Damian's name in passing? Paranoia was seeping into Cain's mind, not because he felt guilt, but because he feared losing control. The more Lily pulled away, the more frantic he became. His threats against Damian became more violent, his visits more erratic. One day he came with a scalpel, running it along the edge of Damian's ribs while calmly saying, "She'll say yes soon, or you'll bleed out before sunrise." But Cain miscalculated one thing: Damian's will to survive. Even as infection gnawed at him, even as the hallucinations worsened and his body weakened, Damian held on. He knew that Lily was strong, that she would never give her heart to a man who tried to own it like a possession. He knew she would never choose Cain out of fear. And he prayed that someone, anyone, would uncover the truth before it was too late. The basement had no windows, but Damian imagined the sun still rose above him, that justice still had a chance to shine its light into the dungeon of lies where he was buried alive. His body was failing, but his spirit remained, fueled by love and the hope that Cain's house of cards would collapse under its own weight. As whispers began circulating in Nice about inconsistencies in the timeline of Damian's death, a new sense of urgency emerged among those closest to him. Someone had seen a man matching his description days after his supposed death. A delivery driver had reported strange noises near the Cain estate. And Lily, haunted by dreams in which Damian called out to her from behind locked doors, began questioning everything. Her intuition, long dulled by grief, was awakening. She began to sense that the tragedy she had accepted might be a lie. But could she find the truth before it was too late? For now, the clock ticks mercilessly in the shadows. Cain's twisted ultimatum still hangs in the air, Lily's heart in exchange for Damian's life. But love built on manipulation is not love, and secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of coming back to destroy those who try to wield them. The next move could change everything. The next whisper could become a roar. And the next choice Lily makes might decide whether Damian lives to tell his story, or becomes the final victim in a love that turned to madness. Lily, in her quiet mourning, had begun to see a version of Cain she hadn't encountered in years. Attentive, sincere, heartbreakingly patient. His voice softened when he spoke of the past, his eyes dimmed with apparent remorse, and his gestures seemed gentle, almost hesitant, as if he were ashamed of ever having lost her. And perhaps, for a fleeting moment, Lily believed he had changed. In the confusion and vulnerability of grief, she allowed herself to lean on him, to listen when he claimed that Damian's death had forced him to re-examine his life. She thought perhaps tragedy had transformed Cain the way loss sometimes does, reshaping sharp edges into humility. But that, she would come to realize, was the first and most devastating illusion, because it wasn't redemption that drove Cain. It was conquest. It was obsession. And now, Lily had already stepped too far into the trap. For Cain, every interaction with Lily was a careful performance. Every tear he shed, every story he recalled, every word of regret he whispered was a string in the web he was weaving around her heart. What Lily mistook for emotional depth was actually precision manipulation, a dangerous symphony composed to lull her into trust. Cain was a master of layered deceit, and this time, his plan had stakes he had never dared before. If Lily loved him again, he would win back not only the woman he considered rightfully his but also control over the narrative of his life. If she refused, then Damian would die, and Cain would bury the last man who had ever threatened his place beside her. But even Cain, in his brilliance, could not control every variable. The wild card was Carter, the silent enforcer, the man Cain trusted to carry out his orders and maintain the secrecy of Damian's confinement. Carter had been loyal for years, but loyalty born from fear has its limits. Lately, Carter had been acting strange, distracted. He lingered too long in places he used to avoid, and his eyes flinched at the mention of Lily's name. Cain noticed. And he didn't need proof to sense betrayal. He was the kind of man who could smell it long before it reached the surface. So he began testing Carter, feeding him false details, watching how he reacted, quietly tightening the leash. If Carter was slipping, Cain would find out, and if Carter turned against him, there would be consequences no one could escape. Still, the real danger lay beneath it all, in the truth, clawing its way to the light. Damian, weak and ragged, had tried everything he could to make himself heard. He screamed into the darkness until his throat bled, banged his chains against the metal bars until his hands were raw, whispered Lily's name like a prayer into the silence of the underground chamber. But no one came. The walls were too thick, the property too remote, and the world too convinced he was dead. He began to hallucinate sounds, footsteps that weren't there, voices calling from beyond the walls. He begged Carter during the brief moments of food delivery, but Carter only stared with hollow eyes and said nothing. The horror of Damian's captivity wasn't just the physical pain. It was the isolation, the hopelessness, the maddening knowledge that life continued above him while he was erased from it. Meanwhile, Lily began noticing things she couldn't ignore. Cain was too calm, too collected for a man grieving someone who had died in his presence. He never mentioned Damian except in scripted ways, like reading from a prepared eulogy. And his knowledge of the crime scene, what had supposedly happened the night Damian was stabbed, was too convenient, too precise. When Lily brought up inconsistencies in the timeline, Cain would redirect, pivot to emotion, or feign hurt. But Lily's instincts, long dulled by confusion, began stirring to life. Something was off. And then came the dream. In her sleep, Lily found herself walking through a garden filled with white roses, and behind it, a door made of rusted iron. From within it, she could hear Damian calling her name, not in fear, but in agony. She woke in a cold sweat, the sound echoing in her mind. Rationally, she dismissed it as grief playing tricks. But emotionally, something had shifted. She began asking more questions. And Cain, sensing the shift, doubled down. He sent flowers, arranged dinners, spoke of building a future together. Yet the more he tried, the more Lily began to feel that she wasn't falling back in love, she was being hunted. Cain, of course, was already preparing for worst-case scenarios. If Lily began to pull away, he would accelerate his plan. He was already testing different ways to dispose of Damian if the time came, ways that would leave no trace, just another vanishing act lost to the French countryside. He rehearsed it in his mind. How long it would take. How to move the body. How to erase the chamber itself. And through it all, he kept telling himself it was Lily's fault. She could have saved him. All she had to do was say yes. But even geniuses overlook one thing: human emotion cannot be fully controlled. Carter, though silent, had begun to crack. He had stood over Damian's twisted body too many times, heard too many broken pleas, and watched Cain spiral deeper into madness. There was a moment, brief, but real, when Carter looked Damian in the eye and considered mercy. And though he didn't act on it, something shifted. Damian saw it. And so, with every ounce of energy he had left, he spoke quietly during their next encounter. "You're not like him. You don't have to be part of this." And Carter said nothing. But this time, he didn't look away. Back in the city, Lily was about to stumble onto something that would change everything. While sorting through Damian's belongings, what had been returned to her after the funeral, she noticed his phone was missing. Not unusual, but then she found an old GPS smartwatch, tucked into a side pocket of his travel bag, uncharged and forgotten. Curious, she charged it. When it powered on, a log of location data filled the screen. It showed movements in the city, until the night of his death. Then, suddenly, a blank gap followed by a single ping days later, in a remote part of the countryside. Lily froze. The device was still connected to a satellite. And unless someone had moved it to that spot intentionally, there was only one explanation: someone was there. Or had been. Recently. Panic warred with denial. She wanted to believe it was just an error. That Cain, who was downstairs cooking her dinner, was the same man who had once loved her. But now, every fiber in her body screamed that she was being manipulated, that Damian wasn't dead, and that she had been walking through a nightmare wrapped in lace. The woman who had wept at a gravesite was now preparing to uncover a grave truth, and what she would do next might determine not only Damian's fate, but whether Cain's long game would finally collapse under the weight of its own sickness. Because Cain, brilliant as he was, had forgotten one thing: you cannot keep a lie alive forever. Not even in the darkest room. Not even beneath concrete floors and locked doors. Not when the truth starts to scream.